The summer I turned 15 was the summer I learned that some things are better left undisturbed, and that when you go looking for monsters, sometimes you find them. Growing up in a fly-speck town in rural Utah, entertainment was something you had to create for yourself. There were no malls, no movie theaters, no arcade centers where kids could gather after school. Some of my classmates turned to drugs, others buried themselves in video games, and a few threw themselves into sports with the desperate intensity of those who saw athletics as their only ticket out of our forgotten corner of the world. But not me and my buddy Jake. We had discovered something far more thrilling and infinitely more dangerous. We had become explorers of the night. What started as innocent daytime hikes through the fields and foothills surrounding our town had gradually evolved into something darker, more addictive. There was something intoxicating about being out in the wilderness after dark, something that made our hearts race and our senses sharpen to an almost painful degree. The familiar landscape that we knew by heart during the day transformed into an alien world filled with shadows, strange sounds, and the constant awareness that we were no longer at the top of the food chain. Our little town sat nestled in a valley, surrounded by endless stretches of sagebrush fields that rolled away toward distant mountains like a gray-green ocean frozen in time. During the day, these fields seemed benign, almost boring, just another part of the landscape we had grown up with and taken for granted. But at night, they became something else entirely. The sagebrush, most of it reaching waist-high or higher, created a maze of shadows and hiding places. The familiar became foreign, the safe became sinister, and every rustle of wind through the dry branches sounded like something moving with purpose and intent. It was a moonless night in late August when everything changed. Jake and I had convinced two other guys from school, Mike and Danny, to come with us on one of our nocturnal adventures. They had always thought we were slightly crazy for our nighttime wanderings, but teenage boredom eventually overcame their better judgment. Looking back now, I wish they had trusted their instincts and stayed home. I wish we all had. We met at the edge of town near the old Mormon church that sat like a lonely sentinel at the boundary between civilization and wilderness. The church was surrounded on three sides by tall white vinyl fencing, the kind you see around suburban backyards, though out here it looked strangely out of place and somehow ominous in the darkness. To reach the church from the sagebrush fields, you had to walk around the fence to find the opening at one corner, since the side facing the wilderness was almost completely blocked off. This detail would become crucial later, though at the time, it seemed like just another unremarkable feature of our small town's geography. As we set out into the dark ocean of sagebrush, I did what I always did. I found myself a good walking stick. There was something comforting about having that solid piece of wood in my hand, something that made me feel more prepared for whatever we might encounter. Usually, I used it for practical purposes, knocking down weeds or testing the ground ahead of me. But tonight, it felt more like a weapon, though I couldn't have said why. We had been walking for maybe 20 minutes, joking around and trying to impress each other with increasingly elaborate ghost stories, when I first felt it. It started as just a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the kind of feeling you get when someone is watching you from across a room. I had experienced this sensation before during our nighttime expeditions, but tonight it felt different, more intense, more immediate. I stopped walking and turned slowly, scanning the dark landscape behind us. That's when I saw it for the first time. Something large moving through the sagebrush with the fluid grace of a predator. It was staying low, using the cover of the taller bushes, but it was definitely there, definitely real, and definitely following us. From what I could make out in the darkness, it appeared to be roughly the size of a large bear, though something about its movement seemed wrong, too purposeful, too intelligent. "Guys," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "we've got company." Jake, who had been my partner in these expeditions for months, immediately believed me. He had learned to trust my instincts about when we were truly alone and when we were being observed. Mike and Danny, however, just laughed. "Come on, man," Danny said with a grin that I could barely make out in the darkness. "You're just trying to scare us," Mike added. "You guys are paranoid." But I kept my eyes on that shadowy form moving through the brush, and Jake did too. Whatever it was patient, methodical, and it was definitely tracking us. It would move when we moved, stop when we stopped, always maintaining roughly the same distance, always staying just at the edge of visibility. We continued deeper into the fields, and our stalker continued to follow. I caught glimpses of it periodically, a dark shape flowing between the larger clumps of sagebrush, sometimes visible for a few seconds before disappearing again into the maze of shadows. The strangest thing was how quiet it was. Despite its apparent size, it moved with almost perfect silence, never causing the telltale crash of breaking branches or the rustle of disturbed vegetation that you would expect from a large animal. By the time we had traveled about half a mile from the church, Mike and Danny were starting to believe us. They hadn't seen the creature themselves, but they had begun to notice the unnatural quality of the silence around us, the way the usual night sound seemed muted and wrong. When Danny finally suggested that maybe we should head back, his voice carried none of the bravado it had possessed earlier. "Yeah," Mike agreed, and there was no missing the relief in his voice. "It's getting pretty late anyway." I was more than happy to turn around, partly because the thing in the sagebrush had been gradually moving closer throughout our journey, and partly because I was starting to get a really bad feeling about the whole situation. Whatever was out there with us, it wasn't just curious. There was something predatory about the way it moved, something that suggested it was hunting rather than simply observing. As we began our return journey toward the distant lights of the church, our invisible companion continued to pace us. If anything, it seemed to become bolder as we drew closer to town, moving through the brush with less regard for concealment. Several times I caught clearer glimpses of it, and each time I became more convinced that whatever we were dealing with, it wasn't any animal I had ever seen before. We were perhaps 100 yards from the safety of the church parking lot when disaster struck. I'm still not entirely sure how it happened, but somehow I managed to fall significantly behind the other three. Maybe I was distracted by trying to keep track of our stalker, or maybe I was just being more cautious about my footing in the dark. But when I looked up, my friends were near the edge of the church property while I was still deep in the sagebrush. That's when everything changed. The creature that had been shadowing us for the better part of an hour suddenly abandoned all pretense of stealth. I heard the brush crashing as it burst into motion, charging directly toward my position with terrifying speed and power. In that moment of pure terror, I did something that even now seems incredibly stupid. I drew back my walking stick and hurled it as hard as I could in the direction of the approaching sounds. I don't know if I hit anything, and I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran toward the church with every ounce of strength and speed I possessed. Behind me, the creature came crashing through the sagebrush like a locomotive, no longer caring about stealth, focused entirely on the chase. I could hear it gaining on me, could sense its massive presence bearing down on me with each passing second. The 100 yards to the church felt like 100 miles. My lungs burned, my legs felt like they were made of lead, and still the thing behind me kept coming. I could hear its breathing now, harsh and animalistic, could almost feel its hot breath on the back of my neck. Just as I reached the edge of the church parking lot, just as the streetlights began to push back the darkness, I felt something brush against my back, felt what might have been claws or fingers rake across my shirt. And then, suddenly, it was over. The moment I stumbled onto the church property, the presence behind me simply vanished. I spun around, expecting to see some massive beast bearing down on me, but there was nothing there. The parking lot was empty, the sagebrush beyond was still and silent, and it was as if the entire chase had been nothing more than a nightmare. But I knew it had been real. My heart was still hammering against my ribs, my shirt was torn where something had grabbed at me, and somewhere out there in that ocean of sagebrush, something was still waiting. That's when I saw it again, standing at the far edge of the church property where the white vinyl fence met the darkness of the fields. It was partially obscured by shadows, but I could make out enough to realize that I had been completely wrong about what we were dealing with. This wasn't a bear or any other natural predator. The thing standing just outside the reach of the streetlights was roughly humanoid in shape, but impossibly tall and powerfully built. It stood at least 7 feet high, with shoulders that were broader than any humans had a right to be. For several long moments, we stared at each other across the divide, between the light and the safety of the church grounds and the wild emptiness of the sagebrush fields. I couldn't make out details of its face or features, but I could feel its eyes on me, could sense an intelligence that was both alien and hostile. There was something profoundly wrong about its presence, something that made my skin crawl and my primitive brain scream warnings about ancient predators and forgotten dangers. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it melted back into the darkness and was gone. I stood there in the parking lot for Summer camp was supposed to be the highlight of my 9th year on this earth, a break from the suffocating routine of small-town life in Northeast Tennessee, and a chance to make new friends, learn new skills, and create the kind of memories that would last a lifetime. Instead, it became the source of nightmares that would haunt me for decades to come, and the beginning of my understanding that there are some things in this world that should never be seen, never be acknowledged, and never, ever be trusted. The camp had always been held at Millfield Elementary, a cheerful brick building in the heart of town, with bright classrooms, a well-maintained playground, and all the familiar comforts of a place designed for children. I had attended the same camp for 3 summers running and had grown to love its predictable rhythms and safe boundaries. But that year, due to maintenance work that couldn't be postponed, the camp was relocated to Riverside Elementary on the outskirts of town, where the carefully manicured suburban landscape gave way to something wilder, darker, and infinitely more ancient. My first glimpse of the new location filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread. The school sat at the very edge of civilization, with one side facing the familiar world of parking lots and residential streets, while the other side backed up against a wall of forest so thick and impenetrable that it might as well have been the edge of the world. These weren't the friendly woods I was accustomed to, the kind where you might go on nature walks or build forts with your friends. These were old woods, deep woods, the kind that had stood untouched for centuries and seemed to actively resist human intrusion. The trees pressed right up against the school property line, their branches creating a canopy so dense that even on the brightest summer day, the interior of the forest remained shrouded in twilight. There was something profoundly unsettling about the way they loomed over the playground equipment, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of the wind, reaching across the carefully maintained grass like grasping fingers trying to reclaim territory that had once been theirs. My grandmother dropped me off that first morning with her usual cheerful smile and reassuring words, but I could see the concern in her eyes as she took in the imposing wall of forest that dominated the horizon. She lingered longer than usual, chatting with my aunt who worked as one of the camp counselors, and I got the impression that she was reluctant to leave me in this strange new place that felt so fundamentally different from the safe, familiar environment I was used to. The morning activities passed uneventfully, filled with the usual assortment of icebreaker games and get-to-know-you exercises that were designed to help new campers feel comfortable and included. I recognized most of the faces from previous summers, and gradually the familiar routine began to ease some of my initial anxiety. By lunchtime, I had almost convinced myself that my earlier unease had been nothing more than typical nerves about being in a new place. It was during the afternoon free play period that everything changed. The counselors had taken us outside to the playground, and I had naturally gravitated toward my usual group of friends for a game of tag. The playground itself was standard elementary school fare: swings, slides, monkey bars, and a small jungle gym. but it felt different here, more exposed, more vulnerable. Behind us, maybe 50 yards away, the forest stood like a living wall of darkness, watching our every move with the patient malevolence of a predator sizing up its prey. I was standing near the edge of the playground, catching my breath after a particularly energetic chase sequence, when I first became aware that we were not alone. It started as nothing more than a vague sense of being observed, the kind of feeling that makes you turn around in a crowded room to find someone staring at you from across the space. But when I turned to look toward the forest, what I saw made my blood turn to ice in my veins. Deep within the shadows between the trees, barely visible in the dim light that managed to penetrate the canopy, stood a figure that defied every rational explanation I could come up with. It was humanoid in basic shape, but wrong in every conceivable way, as if someone had taken the basic template of human anatomy and stretched it beyond all reasonable proportions. The thing, and I couldn't think of it as anything other than a thing, was impossibly tall, at least 8 feet in height, with limbs that seemed too long and too thin to support its weight. Its skin was the color of old bone, pale to the point of being nearly translucent, and stretched so tightly over its angular frame that I could see the sharp edges of what I assumed were its bones pressing against the surface. Its face, if it could be called that, was a study in alien geometry, all wrong angles and empty spaces where features should have been. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. 2 orbs of sickly yellow-green light that seemed to glow with their own internal fire, burning with an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly inhuman. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other across the divide between the playground and the forest, predator and prey locked in a moment of mutual recognition. I felt my feet begin to move of their own accord, carrying me slowly but inexorably toward the tree line, as if the creature possessed some kind of hypnotic power that was drawing me into its domain. Each step felt heavier than the last, like walking through thick mud or deep sand, but I couldn't seem to stop myself from moving closer to those burning eyes. It was only when I was perhaps 10 feet from the edge of the forest that some primitive survival instinct finally kicked in, snapping me out of whatever trance I had fallen under. The sudden return of conscious thought hit me like a physical blow, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling in my haste to put distance between myself and the pale watcher in the trees. I spun around and ran toward the nearest teacher, Mrs. Henderson, who was supervising a group of children on the swings. Tears streaming down my face and my words tumbling over each other in my desperation to be understood, I tried to explain what I had seen, pointing frantically toward the forest and begging her to look, to see what I was seeing, to validate the reality of the impossible thing that was watching us from the shadows. Mrs. Henderson followed my pointing finger with her eyes, squinting against the afternoon sun as she studied the tree line. After a moment, she knelt down to my level and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, her expression a mixture of concern and barely concealed skepticism. "I don't see anything there, sweetie," she said, in the kind of voice adults use when they're trying to calm down a child who they believe is having an irrational fear. Sometimes when we're in a new place, our imagination can play tricks on us. The shadows in the forest can look like all sorts of things if we stare at them long enough. But when I turned back toward the trees, the creature was still there, still watching, still waiting with the infinite patience of something that had all the time in the world. If anything, it seemed more solid now, more real, as if my acknowledgement of its presence had somehow strengthened its hold on our reality. And as I watched, frozen with terror and fascination, it slowly raised one impossibly long arm in what could only be described as a greeting, its skeletal fingers wiggling in a grotesque parody of a friendly wave. The gesture was so unexpected, so bizarrely human in its mimicry, that it broke through my paralysis and sent me scrambling toward the swing set, desperate to put the solid metal structure between myself and whatever was lurking in the forest. I climbed onto one of the swings and began pumping my legs, not because I wanted to play, but because the rhythmic motion gave me something to focus on other than the pale figure that continued to watch me from its position among the trees. For the remainder of the afternoon, I never once took my eyes off the forest for more than a few seconds at a time. The creature never moved from its initial position, never showed any sign of losing interest in our activities, never gave any indication that it was anything other than completely real and completely focused on me specifically. Other children ran past my swing, laughing and playing, completely oblivious to the ancient evil that was studying them from the shadows not 50 yards away. When the counselors finally called us inside, I felt a surge of relief so intense that it was almost physical. The solid walls of the school building felt like a fortress, a barrier between us and whatever was waiting out there in the darkness between the trees. But even as I walked through the familiar routines of end-of-day activities, part of my attention remained focused on the windows that faced the forest, watching for any sign of movement, any hint that our observer had abandoned its post. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Each morning I would arrive at camp with a sick feeling in my stomach, knowing that at some point during the day we would be required to go outside, and that when we did, it would be waiting for me. The pale watcher never failed to appear during our outdoor activities, always in the same general area, always maintaining the same distance, always watching with those terrible glowing eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul. I tried to tell my aunt about what I was seeing, but like Mrs. Henderson, she attributed my fears to an overactive imagination and the stress of adjusting to a new environment. When I persisted, growing more desperate and insistent with each passing day, she began to worry that I was having some kind of psychological breakdown. She arranged for me to speak with the camp director, a kind but practical woman who listened to my story with the professional patience. The tradition began with my grandfather, passed down through 3 generations of men in my family who shared a love of the wilderness and a belief that the mountains held secrets worth discovering. Every summer, we would pack our gear and head into the high Tatras of Slovakia, those ancient peaks that had stood sentinel over Central Europe for millions of years, weathering ice ages and invasions, revolutions and world wars, remaining constant while the human world below churned and changed around them. My father had inherited this tradition from his own father, and in the summer of 2017, when I was 12 years old and still young enough to believe that the world made sense, it was my turn to carry on the family legacy. We drove through the winding mountain roads in Dad's old Renault, the car groaning and protesting as it climbed the steep grades that led to our destination, a remote campground high in the Tatras where the air was thin and clean and the stars at night burned with an intensity that was impossible to see in the light-polluted valleys below. I was not exactly the ideal hiking companion that summer. At 12, I was carrying more weight than was healthy for a boy my age, the result of too many hours spent indoors with video games and too many meals that came from fast food restaurants rather than home-cooked family dinners. Dad never said anything about my physical condition directly, but I could see the concern in his eyes when he watched me struggle to keep up during our practice hikes near home, and I knew that he was worried about how I would handle the more challenging terrain of the high Tatras. We arrived at the mountain hotel late in the evening, both of us exhausted from the long drive and eager to get some rest before beginning our trek the following morning. The hotel was a sturdy stone building that had been built to withstand the harsh mountain weather, with thick walls and small windows that made it feel more like a fortress than a place of accommodation. Our room was simple but comfortable, with 2 single beds, a small table, and a window that looked out over the dark expanse of mountains that stretched away toward the horizon like the wrinkled surface of some alien planet. The next morning, we ate a hearty breakfast in the hotel restaurant and then set out on foot for the chairlift station that would carry us up the mountain to the beginning of our hiking trail. The chairlift was an old-fashioned affair, the kind with open seats that swayed gently in the wind as they carried passengers up the steep mountainside, offering breathtaking views of the valleys below and the jagged peaks that rose all around us like the backbone of some sleeping giant. As we climbed higher and higher, the air grew thinner and cooler, and the landscape below us transformed from the green pastures and scattered villages of the lower elevations to the barren, rocky terrain of the high alpine zone. There was something both exhilarating and slightly terrifying about being suspended in that chair, dangling hundreds of feet above the rocky slopes, completely dependent on the mechanical systems that carried us upward toward our destination. We reached the top of the chairlift around midday and began our hike along the mountain trail that would take us to our planned camping spot. The path was well marked but challenging, winding through a landscape of granite boulders, stunted pine trees, and patches of snow that had somehow survived the heat of the summer sun. Dad set a steady pace that took my limitations into account, stopping frequently to rest and allowing me to catch my breath while he studied the map and checked our progress. About halfway to our destination, we stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook that provided a panoramic view of the surrounding peaks. As we sat on the rocky ground eating our sandwiches and drinking water from our bottles, a sound echoed across the mountainside that made us both freeze in mid-motion. It was a shriek, high-pitched and piercing, unlike anything I had ever heard before. It seemed to come from somewhere high above us, as if whatever had made it was perched on one of the rocky pinnacles that jutted up from the mountain ridge. "What was that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad was quiet for a moment, listening intently for any repetition of the sound. When none came, he shrugged and tried to give me a reassuring smile. "Probably just a large bird," he said. "Eagles, maybe, or some kind of hawk. The mountains are full of wildlife." But there was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by his own explanation, and I noticed that he spent the rest of our lunch break scanning the sky above us as if expecting to see something that would provide a more satisfactory answer to the question of what had made that unnerving sound. We reached our campsite in the early evening, a small clearing beside a mountain stream that provided fresh water and a relatively flat space to pitch our tent. The location was beautiful but isolated, surrounded by towering peaks that seemed to close in around us as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the rocky landscape and transforming the familiar daylight world into something altogether more mysterious and potentially threatening. Dad was an experienced camper and had come prepared for the challenges of mountain camping. We had brought a high-quality tent that was designed to withstand strong winds and sudden weather changes, sleeping bags rated for much colder temperatures than we expected to encounter, and enough food to last us several days if necessary. The one thing we hadn't anticipated was the problem of finding dry firewood at this elevation, where the combination of snow and mountain storms had left most of the available wood too wet to burn. It was my suggestion that saved our evening meal and possibly our lives. I remembered reading somewhere that birch bark will burn even when wet, and after searching the area around our campsite, Dad found a stand of birch trees growing in a sheltered depression near the stream. We carefully harvested bark from several trees, taking only what we needed and being careful not to damage the living trees, then returned to our campsite to build our fire. The bark burned beautifully, producing a steady flame that allowed us to heat our military-style MREs. Dad had been a soldier years earlier and still had a stockpile of the meals from his service days. As darkness fell around us, the fire became our entire world, a small circle of warmth and light surrounded by the vast emptiness of the mountain wilderness. Above us, the stars appeared one by one in the clear mountain air, more brilliant and numerous than anything I had ever seen in the light-polluted skies near our home. We talked quietly as we ate our dinner, sharing stories and memories, enjoying the simple pleasure of being together in this beautiful and remote place. For a few hours, everything was perfect, exactly the kind of father-son bonding experience that these camping trips were meant to provide. I felt proud of myself for suggesting the birch bark solution, and Dad seemed pleased that I was adapting well to the challenges of mountain camping despite my physical limitations. We settled into our sleeping bags around 9 o'clock, both of us tired from the day's hiking and looking forward to a good night's rest before continuing our adventure the next morning. The last thing I remember before falling asleep was the sound of the stream flowing past our campsite, a gentle, constant murmur that seemed to carry with it all the peace and tranquility of the mountain wilderness. I was awakened sometime around 2 in the morning by a repetition of the sound we had heard earlier that day, the same high-pitched shriek that had puzzled us during our lunch break. But this time it was much closer, much louder, and unmistakably different from any bird call I had ever heard before. There was something almost human about it, as if someone was screaming in pain or terror, but distorted in a way that made it clear that whatever was making the sound was definitely not human. "Dad," I whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. "Dad, wake up. That thing is back." He came awake instantly, the way people do when they're camping in unfamiliar territory, and their subconscious mind remains alert for potential danger even while they sleep. He reached for the .357 revolver that he always carried when we were in the wilderness, a precaution against the bears and wolves that were known to inhabit these mountains, and the flashlight that he kept beside his sleeping bag. "Stay here," he whispered, unzipping the tent flap. "Don't come out unless I call for you." He disappeared into the darkness outside our tent, and I lay there in my sleeping bag, straining to hear what was happening beyond the thin nylon walls that suddenly seemed like completely inadequate protection against whatever was out there in the night. For several minutes, there was nothing but silence, and then I heard Dad's voice, tight with tension and disbelief. "Jesus Christ," he said, so quietly that I almost didn't catch the words. A moment later, the silence was shattered by 2 gunshots in rapid succession, the sound echoing off the surrounding peaks like thunder. Then Dad was back inside the tent, his face pale in the dim light of the flashlight, and his hands shaking slightly as he set the revolver down on the floor of the tent. "What did you see?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I really wanted to know the answer. Dad was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had just witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. "There was something behind that stand of pine trees," he said slowly. "Something big, really big. It was standing upright, like a person, but it was at least 7 feet tall, maybe 8. And it had wings, son. Not feathers like a bird, but skin like a bat's wings stretched between its arms and body." "Did you hit it?" I asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "It disappeared back into the trees after I fired. We'll check in the morning, see if there's any sign of blood or if I managed to hit it." Neither of us got much sleep for the rest of that night. We lay in our sleeping bags, listening to every sound from outside the tent, jumping at every rustle of wind through the pine trees or splash from the nearby stream. Dad kept the revolver in his hand, ready to defend us if whatever he had seen decided to return, and I found myself staring at the tent walls, half expecting to see some monstrous silhouette pressed against the fabric from outside. When morning finally came,